Hello, everyone, and welcome to Stephanie Ann Again. I am your host, Stephanie Brinkerhoff, and I am here to talk about all things deconstruction, spiritual crisis, psychedelics, Jungian psychology, and basically just my process of discovering who I am again and again after a lifetime in Mormonism. I tend to be a very uncurated person, so much of this podcast is stream of consciousness style. I aim to create a space of vulnerability and human-to-human connection by sharing personal stories and real-life experiences rather than just sharing information. So thank you so much for tuning in. Let's go ahead and jump in. Okay, everyone, welcome to my first podcast episode about the Mormons. This one's going to be about the Mormons. What are the Mormons doing? Does anybody know what the Mormons are doing? This is my question. So I grew up in Utah. I grew up in Davis County, Utah. And in Utah, Davis County and Utah County are about as Mormon as you can get. It's like you go to church on Sundays, but then you have church throughout the week. And then you have church at school even. Like one of your class periods is church. There's a Mormon church like every 3 blocks. You ask people like, oh, are you a member or are they a non-member? And it's like, you don't even have to say a member of what. Everybody knows what you're talking about if you're a member or if you're not a member. And I was very, very sheltered. I lived a very sheltered life. I know a lot of people talk about, having bad experiences with church leaders or like the hypocrisy that happens in, with the members or whatever. And I never really experienced that for whatever reason. I was just surrounded by really good kind of like salt of the earth, down to earth, humble people with good intentions. I never had bad experiences with the members, which is very rare. I am coming to find out. And this very much shaped my experience with Mormonism and also leaving Mormonism, which I will obviously dive into here. So there was a couple weeks ago when I was in therapy, and this has actually been surfacing a lot in therapy recently. It's this memory of sitting in my kitchen with my kids. My kids are there. They're doing whatever I don't know what they're doing. I'm sitting at the table. And it was the moment, this was back in 2021. It was the moment that I realized that God was fake. Mormon God, and I don't even want to say Mormon God because Mormon God was God, right? It's like if Mormon God is fake, then God itself is fake. And I was realizing this in that moment. And it was kind of like this deep sinking blackness. Like, do you guys remember the first Vision video? Does anyone here remember the first Vision video where Joseph Smith, the Living Scriptures one, like the cartoon, and he like goes out into the forest and then he's like praying to God and then he's overcome by mists of darkness. And he's like, and he's like being attacked on the ground by like this black cloud. And then he like reaches for Jesus and Jesus saves him or something like that. That's what it felt like in that moment. It felt like I was being like covered in darkness, like this sinking feeling. My whole body felt like it was just like I was entering some sort of hell. And my kids were talking to me. They were like, I don't know, asking for food or something, but like whatever they were saying to me, it was not registering. It's like they were looking at me and talking to me. And I was just like, what? Like, mom. And I'd just be like, wait, like say that again, like what? And it was just going right through me because I, in that moment, did not have the ability to like intake any information. And it sounds like a small thing. I mean, I'm assuming it could maybe sound like a small thing to realize that God is fake. And that's a loaded statement right there. It all depends on how you define God, right? I'll just say the God that I believed in was fake. So it might sound like a small thing, like, yeah, of course, God does not live on a cloud in a robe on another realm and he's not watching you. You know what I mean? Like, of course that's fake. Like it sounds ridiculous. It sounds like it's like a fairy tale, like a myth, right? And so like losing that belief or recognizing that wasn't real, it should be like, yeah, obviously Like, welcome to reality. But there was so much tied into that symbol of God for me that moment was incredibly traumatizing. And that's obviously why it's been surfacing in therapy in the last couple weeks, because it's something that I still am like processing through. And it actually sent me, from that point on, I entered like a full-blown spiritual crisis, nervous breakdown. Like, I got super, super sick. I couldn't work for like 6 months. It was like my entire, my ability to function collapsed. And I was going down this rabbit hole recently around the difference between terror and horror. I was just very curious. Because I'm noticing in myself, I have noticed many times, that I carry in my body this feeling of horror, which is fine. I'm sure a lot of us do, right? Like, we're all carrying around horror at this point. But I became very curious about, like, what's the difference between terror and horror? Because I'm definitely carrying horror, not terror. I mean, also terror, but horror too. And so, like, I started to compare the two, and terror is obviously just like you're really scared, like an extreme amount of fear. Maybe you're about to die, fear for your safety, whatever. Something bad's about to happen. But horror, there's an added dimension of a sense of moral wrongness to whatever's happening. So it's terrifying, but also there's this sense that whatever's happening is very, very morally wrong. And, it's like, this is everything that I was like researching and reading about. It's like, why do animals not experience horror? At least as far as I know. They probably experience terror, right? Like, if they're about to die, they're obviously scared. But they don't have this sense of moral wrongness. Unless somebody knows something about animals that I don't. It seems like a human thing, right? Like, we evolved differently. And what is it about the way that we evolved that gives us this sense of moral right and moral wrong? Where it's like, if you see a violent death as a human, you feel this sense of horror, where it's like animals, they live purely on like instinct, and they don't, they see violent deaths all the time, and they're not registering it as this like moral failing, right? So I started reading into what Jung says about this. He talks about how human beings live in the world of symbol, meaning you have the outer objective reality of like, here's my body, here's the chair, like this is the physical world. But then you have the inner world of symbol that is just as real as the outer world of like the physical realm, right? And human beings need cohesion in their symbols in order for the psyche to orient to reality. So it's kind of like we evolved to, like, we have the ability to interpret. We have the ability to like imagine and like think into the future. And we have like social codes and rules that we follow and that we all kind of like adhere to. And we make meaning out of things. And this is how our psyche orients in all of the chaos of reality. So you see this everywhere. You see this like, this is why people pick beliefs, whatever it is, and they adhere to them, not just religious beliefs. It could be your political beliefs. It could be your belief in science. It could be a sports team. It could literally be anything. You pick something that symbolizes, it symbolizes whatever it is that it symbolizes for you, and you adhere to it. You believe in it. You hold to it because you need cohesion in your ability to make meaning, in your ability to interpret your reality. And whatever the thing is just a symbol, right? It's like, Jesus is the perfect example of this. It's like Jesus is the symbol of an archetype. He's a symbol of so much more than like whatever literal Jesus actually was, And at this point, Jesus symbolizes something different to every single person, depending on how you interpret the symbol of Jesus. So it doesn't matter what the symbol is. It's the amount of like psychic and emotional energy and interpretation and meaning that you attach to the symbol that makes it so powerful. And human beings live this way. As much as we love to think that our beliefs are objective, especially in Mormonism, right? It's like your beliefs are literal. It's not interpretation. It's not symbol. This is the literal truth. As much as we want to believe that, all of our symbols are just that. They're just symbols. But we need them in order to orient to reality. And Jung talks about how if we don't have cohesion in our symbols, like let's say you have a symbol like I did, Mormon God, and it crumbles, or you have too many of your symbols or too many of the ways that you orient to reality or you find safety, if they crumble or they dissolve all at once, that's when the psyche goes into psychosis or it loses touch with quote unquote reality and it goes into chaos. And this is basically what happened to me. So going back to this experience in my kitchen where it's like, you know, realizing that God was fake. Everything that I had tied into that symbol of God was basically, you know, the symbol of Mormon God was basically how I learned to find safety in my body. It was how I learned to orient to love, to peace, to compassion, to safety. It was how I learned to orient to my ability to like ground and feel stable in life and in my body. Because obviously that's what I was taught. I mean, even before I was born, it was like I was being sung primary songs when I was in the womb, right? And I was taught my whole life, God is where love comes from. God is where peace comes from. God is where all the good things in life come from God. And then, of course, the bad things, quote unquote bad things, come from Satan. So when I lost the symbol of God, my body, my psyche did not know how to orient to safety anymore. It wasn't like a philosophical thing where it was just like, oh, I lost my belief in God. And now I can choose a different belief, you know? And now actually all those things that I thought came from God actually just come from me, you know, like surprise. It was not like I could just easily make that switch. It was like my nervous system developed, like my neural pathways in my brain developed around these blocks of truth in Mormonism. And then when they were taken away, it was like I didn't have the neural pathways to orient otherwise. And so it wasn't just a philosophical thing, right? It wasn't like, I think sometimes like on the outside, people can look at Mormonism and they're like really fascinated by it, right? They're like, the magic underwear and like the secret handshakes and like, what in the hell are the Mormons doing? And like, you know, they're kind of like, everybody can see that the Mormons are doing a weird thing and they're like fascinated by it, right? It's obviously very popular in the media right now too. So it can be easy to be like, yeah, like, you know, it can feel silly, I guess is what I'm trying to say. It can feel really silly to be like, oh, leaving Mormonism is traumatizing. Like, oh, you lost your belief in your magic underwear god? Like, how sad for you. But the point I'm trying to make is that when your brain sort of develops around these truths and you leave, it's not just like you're losing a philosophical belief. You're losing your symbols. You are losing the symbols that you used to find cohesion in reality. Like what it felt like is that like I like deconstellated. Is that a word? That's probably not even a word. It was like it was almost like my psyche felt like it dissolved and I couldn't it couldn't constellate again. It couldn't come back together because it didn't have the right symbols. It didn't have any symbols. And the symbols it had been given were so rigid and so black and white that there wasn't any room for like nuance or any like flexibility. It was almost as if the psyche shattered. And then I had to like slowly put the pieces back together because Mormonism is so literal. It's not like there was any flexibility. And so losing that symbol was like detrimental to like my mental, I want to say my mental health, but it was like my ability to just even function, like my psychic ability to orient. So feel bad for me, guys. Okay, just kidding. That's not what I'm trying to say. I'm going somewhere with this. So I had a friend who came into town a couple of weeks ago, and he had never been to Utah before. And I was driving him past like the church office buildings and and Temple Square and like the hub, like the Mecca, the center of Mormonism, right? And he was like, wait. Like, okay, how is the church doing this? Like, he was seeing like the scale of like how much power Mormonism has in Utah. Like, Mormonism is literally the government too. It's like Mormonism runs the state. It's everywhere. And he was like, how are they doing this? How are these people, like, what sort of witchcraft? Are they like the world's greatest salesmen? Like, do we need to take notes from them? Like, how in God's name are they getting millions of people who are well educated, people who are like psychologists, doctors, lawyers, to pay them billions of dollars to support this completely fabricated belief system? Like, how are they doing this? And this is my answer to this question. It's the way that Mormonism becomes a symbol for its members. It becomes a symbol of something much larger than just magic underwear and secret handshakes. If you think about like when the church began back in Joseph Smith's day, and I honestly, if I'm being totally honest, I don't know a ton about church history because they hide, when you're Mormon, they hide real church history from you. And, you know, so once you leave, you gotta, you know, do all your own research to find out the actual truth of what happened. And when I left the church, it had nothing to do with church history. It was a completely separate thing. And so I've only gone down that rabbit hole a little bit. So forgive my ignorance. But if you think about the church when Joseph Smith was alive, back then it was just like a whole bunch of essentially like God's going to send you to hell churches, right? It was like kind of like Bible bashing type mentality, you know, damnation and you're a sinner, whatever. And then Joseph Smith comes in and he's like, I had a direct experience with God, and you also can directly communicate with God. And God is a loving God. And we actually don't believe in hell. We just believe in, like, you know, a much gentler version of hell, which is, I won't even get started on that. But basically, he came in and he framed Christianity as like this old, outdated thing. And he was like, I am receiving new personal revelation, and you also can. That's much more loving and like hopeful. And, you know, Joseph Smith as well was like sort of like a mystical dude, right? Like he had like crystals and seer stones and stuff, and he was like going on treks in the woods or whatever the hell he was doing. And so he was appealing to people's individual connection with the divine, or with God, as he would call it. There's like this piece in all of us that knows that we are connected to wholeness, that knows that we are connected to something bigger than us. And he was capitalizing on that. He was like, hey, in this religion, that thing that you feel in yourself, that connection to wholeness or to God or the divine or whatever you want to call it, he's like, that actually is real, but you have to be a member of this church in order to access it, right? Like, it's the gift of the Holy Ghost. It's like, you know, and then this is where things get all convoluted, where it's like he's appealing to people's legitimate spiritual connection, and then he's attaching it to the symbol of Mormonism. He's attaching it to the symbol of Mormon God, to the Holy Ghost, to all of the covenants and the rituals that you go through, that, you know, he tells the members that they need all of that in order to access this part of them that's innate, that they're born with. So this is a really long way of saying that this is how the church does it. This is what Mormonism is doing. There's a whole other slew of things you could say, right? Like, they're obviously very manipulative. They're really, really good at creating community. Mormon community is like unmatched. I stand by that. Like, the way they're organized, the way that they have like so much structure in place where it's like everyone is taken care of, everyone, no one is forgotten. If you're in the Mormon community, like, you feel so held and you feel so special. They got that like love bombing thing down to a T, right? So it's like, that's obviously at play. This sort of love bombing, feeling of specialness, feeling of belonging to something, community, like that really gets people hooked. But that is not alone what they're doing. At least for me and in my experience, the reason that I believed Mormonism for so long is because my connection to wholeness was tied to the symbol of Mormonism. And that's essentially what they want you to do, right? Like, they want you to think that this connection to your own soul, this connection to the divine, whatever you want to call it, they want you to believe that it's outside of you and that it comes from obeying the church's rules, being baptized, performing the rituals, the covenants, whatever. And this is why, you know, there's so many really intelligent people who still believe in Mormonism, because it's the same thing. They're connecting to this innate part of themselves, this inherent thing that we're all born with, and they're believing that it's because they are Mormon. And so when you like think about taking that away from someone, like in my experience, it was like, I felt like when I realized that God was fake, it was like my own life force had been taken from me. I didn't know how to access that for a long time. And it's still like a process of recovery for me, because my brain got so fucked up tying, you know, my own connection to myself to these symbols in Mormonism. So of course people stay. Of course people are staying. Like, they have clear cut black and white answers about where we come from, where we're going. Like, everything is nice and clean and spelled out. At least the church makes it, you know, they try to make it appear that way. And then they're having an incredible connection to community, feeling very held and safe. And then they're having a direct sort of quote unquote recipe for how to connect to their own, for how to connect to wholeness, for how to connect to spirituality. That's the perfect recipe for a cult. And this is always how cults are, right? It's like they tie in some sort of spiritual truth or some sort of spiritual connection to a bunch of other shit. And so then people, because they're feeling the spiritual connection, because they're feeling the spiritual truth, they cannot untangle or discern between what's theirs, what's real, and what is just all the other added garbage. And then before you know it, you have people who are giving billions of dollars to an organization that's completely fabricated. That is the power of symbol. That is the power of how much the psyche needs symbols in order to, and ritual and community and all of that in order to orient to reality. Jung talks about how in the psyche there's the religious function. So it's like, whether we want to believe it or not, we have a religious function, which is basically the part of us that wants to worship. It wants to experience devotion. It wants to experience being a part of something that's bigger than itself. And if you don't believe in God, your religious function will find another way. You will worship, like I said, you will worship your politics. You will worship science. Science will become your God. You will worship your sports team. It doesn't matter. The psyche wants to experience devotion to something. So going back to my memory of sitting in the kitchen with my kids and realizing that God was fake, people talk about leaving Mormonism and I hear like a lot the phrase escape, like, oh, you escaped. And, people will like say, I'm proud of you for leaving. I still remember the first friend that I had who told me congratulations after I left and who told me that they were proud of me. And I didn't quite understand it at the time because, Mormonism, they're not physically detaining anyone. They're not like forcing anyone to stay physically, but it really is something that you have to psychologically escape from. I mean, if you just think about in your own life, whatever it is that you do that connects you to something bigger than you, it could be any sort of spiritual practice. It could be any type of, it could even just be nature. It could be getting in like a flow state when you're in like a state of creativity and like you're in that sort of, you guys know what a flow state is. I don't need to explain that. It could be anything that connects you to something bigger than yourself. If you just imagine that like you live your whole life experiencing that, and someone the entire time has been telling you, oh, the only reason you're feeling that is because you're a member of this organization or this church. If you leave this church or this organization, you lose that. That feeling that you feel when you go out into nature, that's just because you're a part of our church. That feeling that you feel is actually just the Holy Ghost and because you were baptized. And if you commit sins or you leave the church, then like you can't have that anymore. And then imagine that not only are they telling you that you need this religion or this organization to access that, but imagine that the people who are telling you this are people who are really good, smart people. It's not like my experience in particular, my parents are like 10 out of 10. You just ask any of my siblings, they are about as good as you can get. Incredibly wonderful people. They're not hypocritical. They're just great, you guys. They're honestly wonderful. So if you had like legitimate role models in your life that you really trusted and looked up to, that gave you no reason not to trust them, and not only your parents, but just like leaders or friends parents, people in your environment that you've known since you were born, who are beautiful human beings. In the mind of a child, there is absolutely no reason to question any of it. There's no reason to not only question it, but then when you get to the point that you recognize that said reality is actually not true, not only do you experience it as like an incredibly disorienting, but it's also a massive betrayal. And I think this is one of the most confusing parts about leaving Mormonism for me, and I think for a lot of people, is that like you feel like you have this weird Stockholm syndrome where you're like, okay, I can now see that like this church is not real and that this is, whatever the hell is happening here. I've been bamboozled. I can see this. And now I'm going to engage in my process of trying to untangle whatever the hell has happened in my brain. And all throughout the process, I'm going to feel an immense amount of grief. There's obviously anger, there's rage for being lied to, for being manipulated, for being taken advantage of, for all of the weird beliefs that they've instilled in you that have like fucked up your brain and made you have shame and all this stuff. There's all of that. And then on top of that, there's an incredible amount of grief, at least there has been in my process, for losing something that you loved so much, for losing a reality that felt so nourishing and nurturing and safe and held and easy to understand. There's all of this grief for the thing that hurt you because you have tied in your own spirituality to this thing that has hurt you. You have to grieve these like fake relationships with Mormon God and Jesus. And I don't want to say it's complicated when I say fake because, right, everything is symbolic. So it's not that it's necessarily inherently fake, but it's definitely not inherently literal like the church teaches you. And so for me, there was this massive grieving process of like, oh, I've been lied to, albeit unintentionally by the people in my immediate life, at least. I've been lied to. The people who I trusted the most are also being lied to. And then the people at the top in the church who I just like idolized and loved, they're lying to me. Everyone's lying to me. Now I'm going to go through this process of deconstruction, and the entire time I'm going to be so heartbroken about losing this reality that was actually fucking me up, that I couldn't see was actually fucking me up. But for some reason, I'm going to be grieving it because it was so wonderful for me, but it was actually terrible for me. But it was real, but it wasn't real, but it felt real. And it's just like the whole thing is like a giant mind fuck, where it's like you feel like you're grieving something that wasn't even real, but then somehow it was. And how can you grieve losing the thing that like destroyed you? It is complicated, to say the least. So my process of leaving Mormonism, this was back in 2021, and there was a lot else that was happening at the time. Like I was going through a divorce. I was having experiences with psychedelics. I lost all of my friends, my community. So there was so much happening at once. It was like way too much too fast, which contributed to this like nervous breakdown process that I entered, that I'm still recovering from. But in all of the therapy that I've been doing, or inner work that I've been doing, or whatever I've been, trying to do to get to a place where I feel safe in my body again, I have been unable to separate Mormonism from any of it, whether it's, my psychedelic experiences or even experiences from childhood, all the stuff that you have to like dive into in therapy, right? Like that you repress in your body. I can't separate Mormonism from any of it because it was so all-encompassing, and it was the filter through which I was interpreting my life experiences. So it wasn't just like, oh, maybe I had some traumatic experiences in childhood, or, oh, maybe I just had a few traumatic experiences on psychedelics, whatever. It was the fact that I was experiencing these things through a Mormon psyche, through the Mormon lens, which greatly contributed to how they affected me and my ability to be able to process or not process them. So I say all of this to answer the question, what are the Mormons doing? They're doing a weird thing. They're doing a weird thing that's really insidious, and it's really, really hard to see. I was the last person in my family, or out of my siblings, to leave the church. All my siblings left like 15 years before me. And I was just like, the church could have said or done basically anything. And I would have been like, I still believe this because of everything that I just explained, because of how much my own internal world and sense of self and my ability to like make sense of reality was tied into that religion. Another thing too that I think is really worth mentioning is the difference between the way the church is perceived from the outside versus how it is presented to its members. The church has a way of presenting things to its members that fosters a lot of cognitive dissonance, but also there's a lot of conflicting messages that you are kind of trained to ignore. So from the outside, you might see, like they believe that, in polygamy or whatever, like that it's okay to have multiple wives, or, they think that, you're going to have your own planet when you die. And they believe in something called outer darkness and, whatever sort of wacky beliefs that seem kind of like off the wall. When you're in the church, they have this way of talking about those things, but also simultaneously talking about contradicting messages. Like the queer community, I feel like, is the perfect example of this. Mormonism is so much more harmful for the queer community, in my opinion, even though I can't speak to it myself being a straight woman, but I have people that I'm close to who have been through this. And the reason that it's so harmful is because they're not direct about what it is that they actually believe. So it's like, okay, you might say, in the doctrine says that, if you want to go to heaven, you have to be married, a man and a woman have to be married, or whatever the hell. Like you can't be gay, or like, oh, when you die and you go to the next life, like you're not going to be gay anymore. Like whatever, the things that they actually say in the doctrine are different than how it's presented to the members. So those things are there, but they kind of get pushed under the rug. And everything on the surface is really catered to this sort of niceness, this sort of feeling of inclusivity, and this feeling of, it's really focused on like love and light and peace and joy. And so everything that's happened in the history, everything that's weird about the doctrine, everything that's super controversial, you have this way of kind of like pushing it under the rug, or like kind of just going around it or ignoring it, because everything that's positive about the church is what they focus on. And, they'll say conflicting things like, gay people are welcome here. But then it's just like, what are you actually saying? Like, they're not being direct. So it's very, very confusing for people who are on the inside, people who are members, because they feel really special. They feel really taken care of. They feel really loved. And they don't realize the truth of what's actually being said. The truth of the actual history, which is, like I said, hidden from you. And the only way that they can get to that point where they can have so much, I want to say like emotional influence over you, to get you to the point where you can ignore stuff like that, is through a lot of psychological and emotional manipulation. There's a lot of love bombing. There's a lot of gaslighting. There's a lot of like subtle coercion. There's a lot of fear mongering. There's a lot of very classic traditional, I would say like narcissistically abusive tactics that the church uses to get people sort of like entangled in this web that feels like love, feels like connection and safety, but actually is something completely different. So for anybody who is in this process, whether it's Mormonism or something similar, I think something that I hear a lot is that like people don't understand why they're struggling so bad. Like it should just be like, oh, I don't believe this anymore, so I'm just going to leave. And like, and that's why members too, current Mormon members, are always like, you leave the church, but you can't leave it alone, or whatever they say. And it's because people are having a really hard time even understanding what happened to them. It's like you can't see on the outside. On the outside, it's like we go to church and we wear our magic underwear and we do these rituals with these weird clothes in the temple. And it's like, it's very sort of like fluffy, on the surface. And so it's like, how can you process trauma that you can't even see? And this is why we talk about it and we talk about it and we talk about it, or we are attempting, I think a lot of people, obviously can't speak for other people, but I know for me in my own process, attempting to make sense of what we even experience, because it's not, just like, it's not black and white. Like it's a very convoluted, confusing thing to understand. So if you are in this process and you're like, why am I struggling so bad? I imagine it has something to do with some of the things that I mentioned, where you're not changing a philosophical belief. You are trying to like reorient to reality and reorient to safety. And Mormonism can be very, very sheltering, like I mentioned. So you're also, when you leave, you're coming face to face with everything that the church kind of like protected you from, in theory. It's like, it's essentially like growing out of a fantasy, is how it feels. And there's like a significant amount of like developmental stunting. The members of the church are really just like children in a lot of ways because they want the church to be the parent. They want the church to be who they rely on, who they depend on. And so you don't ever fully individuate. You don't ever fully grow up all the way. And so leaving, it's like you're undoing everything that I just talked about in your psyche. You're having to face reality in a way that you never had to before as you were being quote unquote protected by the church. And you're having to play catch up developmentally with all of the ways that you were intentionally stunted to keep you in a sort of infantilized state of being so that you relied on the parent or the church. So it makes perfect sense if you're deconstructing that you're having a hard time. And you know what's so infuriating about this to me is that like religious trauma or religious abuse or whatever, it's not even listed in the DSM-5. So it's one of those things that it's like, you know, if you have a type of trauma or have experienced a type of abuse that's very like obviously like everyone can relate to it, like you go through a horrific experience and people are like, oh, we recognize that this is horrific. And therapists recognize that this is a horrible thing that you experience. It's like a universally understood experience. Experiencing religious trauma or religious abuse is so different because half of the planet doesn't even think it's real. Half of the planet is just like, oh, that's like, well, you know, like, why can't you just change what you, blah, 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 change your beliefs? Like, it's fine. Just leave us alone, whatever. Like, it's, they don't even acknowledge it as a real thing. And so it can be hard to not gaslight yourself and to recognize in yourself the severity of what it is that you experienced and what you're going through. But I just know for myself, in my own experience, like I said, that the process has, it sent me into a complete nervous breakdown and a state of disorientation and illness and inability to regulate. So it is definitely not a small thing. So give yourself some credit for doing a really hard thing that will be way worth it in the long run and better for your children if you have children. And just better for yourself, even if you don't have kids. Okay, thank you guys so much for listening to my ramblings and my rants. I will be back to share more with you soon.